You want to start?
Not right now, honey. I'm just busy at the moment. Great Scott! Hi, Lester, Wisher Engineer. I've had a lot of requests from viewers to redo the Mace versus Flail tests. So I reassembled the DIY Mace and Flail in order to do some further tests. Once the tests were complete, I disassembled the test weapons into their constituent parts. Because in Queensland, maces and flails are restricted weapons. They were merely held together with cable ties and were meant only to be used for the purposes of these tests. As such, they're not battle-worthy and would most likely fall apart with repeated use or if used against any hard targets like those pesky knights in shining armor. One of my viewers, Geek of Allness, asked for me to do a more detailed analysis of the force time graphs comparing my bare hand striking with my weapon striking. As a result of this suggestion, I've done just that, and I'll show you the results of this investigation later in this video. I noticed some very interesting interactions in these graphs, which I will discuss later. I performed the tests with a pad of EVA matte squares strapped onto the front of the load cell, since I did not want to damage the original load cell padding with these weapon tests. I also performed tests with side strikes instead of overhead strikes to eliminate the effect of gravitational acceleration on the strikes. I attempted to incorporate more reach into the mace and flail tests, as some of my viewers pointed out that in my previous tests the strikes were too restricted. Also, bear in mind that there are sources of error associated with these tests, not the least of which is my natural human performance variations. I'm not a machine. Firstly, I did some backfist tests to establish a baseline. These were significantly below my peak performance, but they were fine for the purposes of the comparison. I then performed some strikes with the mace and the flail, trying to incorporate more extension in my strikes. My backfist strikes varied in the range 3,900 to 4,500 newtons. The flail strikes varied in the range 2,600 to 2,900 newtons. And the mace strikes varied in the range 3,800 to 4,600 newtons. One of my viewers asked me to do a test where I swung the flail around repeatedly to build up rotational energy before striking with it. I did a few tests to demonstrate this with poor results. These flail strikes varied in the range 2,600 to 2,800 newtons. So no real improvement there. As a technique, it doesn't work very well in that it is not easy to build up rotational energy swinging a 500-gram flail head around a long shaft while holding onto the base of the shaft with one hand. It may have been possible if you were holding the top of the flail shaft near to the flexible link, or indeed holding the flail shaft with both hands to stabilize the shaft. But if you were holding up near the head of the flail shaft, it would have defeated the object of having a shaft in the first place, because it would have severely restricted your range. And if you were using the flail with two hands, you would really beg to ask the question why you weren't using a two-handed flail to begin with. It made no real difference to the amount of impact force that I was able to generate. There were also a few comments regarding the use of the flail to strike around or over obstructions such as shields or other weapon blocks. I demonstrated this with some success by setting up a pole barrier to the side of the load cell to represent the edge of a shield or a weapon block. These flail strikes varied radically from 1200 to 2200 newtons, depending on how the shaft of my flail impacted the barrier. The case could be made that a drop of 20 to 50% in impact force may be acceptable if the alternative would have been a blocked or deflected attack. The reduction in impact force is due to the fact that I'm continuing to modify the amount of energy and force being transmitted to the target through the flexible connection even after the flail head impacts the target. I will show you some evidence for this later. Therefore, interfering with the flail's swing before impact can rob the strike of some energy and force. However, a percentage will still get through. After working with the flail in these tests, I've come to a conclusion about its use based partially on my knowledge of the history of some of the weapons used in traditional Kung Fu. I believe that the flail was first and foremost an agricultural implement that was then adapted and applied as a weapon. It may have grown in stature and popularity not because of its effectiveness as a weapon, but because many of the common folk would have been familiar with its use because of their involvement in agricultural activity. Its popularity may then have inspired other less common folk to adopt its use, not because it was necessarily more effective than other weapons, but because they just liked the look of it, or enjoyed using some of the weapon applications and tactics that were unique to the flail. There are many confirmed historic examples of weapons that became popular because of personal preference or fashion rather than functionality. Similarly, the traditional Chinese two-sectional staff, three-sectional staff, and the traditional Japanese nunchaka were most likely adapted from agricultural implements. I believe that the flexible connection between the handle and the weighted head was specifically introduced to the original agricultural ancestors of the flail to reduce the communication of repeated shock into the hands of the wielder. If you think about pounding rice or grain with a rigid hafted mace for hours every day, day in, day out, you could see how this could lead to repetitive strain injuries from the repeated shock. As a result, the flexible link was introduced to minimize shock transference and to reduce discomfort and the chances of injury. Most weapons of war that were designed specifically as weapons, however, were designed as rigid force and energy communicators. Think of spears, swords, clubs, maces, warhammers, polearms, and so on. Weapons are typically designed to maximize force, pressure, and energy communication because they are typically used over relatively short periods of time and are thus designed to maximize their effect on the wielder's opponent to ensure the wielder's survival. What I would like to show you now is a series of force and time graphs. The time increments on the x-axis are in milliseconds, so these represent very short duration events. The conventional impact waveform involves a large first impact peak during which the kinetic energy is transferred to the load cell from the impacting object. The oscillations that occur thereafter are the load cell's structure reacting to the absorbed energy by deforming and then ringing like a bell. So this can be seen in a graph of my 5 kilogram drop tests, which I performed for a previous video. Which essentially involved just dropping 5 kilogram weights from various heights as a calibration test on the load cell. So as you can see from these graphs, you have a first initial impact peak, which represents the 5 kilogram weight transferring its kinetic energy to the load cell, and then thereafter you have a series of oscillations about the zero axis or the x-axis, which are fairly symmetrical. Except that it's a dying waveform, so energy is slowly, or in this case actually fairly rapidly, being lost from the system. So as the waveform dies down. So no wielder was involved in these tests. So it's literally just a dead test, in inverted commas, in which the kinetic energy is purely being transferred from a weight falling on the load cell. So as a comparison, we'll have a look at the Flail tests that I did. So as you can immediately see, there's a bit of a difference in this waveform when compared to the other waveform. So the first difference is that, or the most notable difference is that actually the waveform appears to have been shifted up, the y-axis. So that you'll notice that after the initial impact peak here, that it doesn't drop as far below the zero axis as it rises again. So as it oscillates, it's not oscillating evenly about the x-axis, the zero axis. So it appears to have been shifted up, but you'll notice that the effect wears off as it gets past the second or third oscillation, and then it dies down and it becomes a standard oscillation about the zero axis. What I believe is that the graph has been shifted due to the superposition of a secondary waveform, which we can't see in this because we're not looking at it directly, but which is actually shifting the whole waveform up, and that I believe behaves a little bit like a longer duration pulse that starts off high and then trails off towards the second or third oscillation. This pulse, the underlying pulse that we can't really see yet, but we can see the effects of it, is my additional contribution to the force and energy of the weapon strike above and beyond the kinetic energy that I'm giving to it. It's being transferred to the weapon through all of the flexible linkages in my body and in the weapon itself in a process which I've called bridging, as I've mentioned in a few of my other videos. It's very exciting to see evidence of it in these graphs. But what exactly is being communicated through the bridging? What is generating the additional force and energy? In short, I believe that it is being generated using an advanced form of core control that is trained in certain traditional systems of martial arts such as my own. I believe that the longer duration pulse that is being generated is generated by pressure variations in the intra-abdominal cavities, such as the pelvic and abdominal cavities, and then communicated to the extremities of the limb or weapon by effective bridging. These graphs are potential evidence of the application of the traditional concept known as chi in striking. For the purposes of this video, let's call the long duration pulse chi. The same phenomenon can be seen in the Mace strikes. So if we have a look at the Mace strikes, you'll see that the graph again is shifted up, possibly by the superposition of this underlying long duration pulse, which also dies away towards the second or third oscillation. But it's most obvious in my bare hand striking. So if we have a look at my bare hand strikes, you'll notice that they're shifted considerably. They're significantly shifted. In fact, some of the plots are shifted so high that they don't actually drop below the zero axis or below the x-axis until the second or third oscillation. So they're lifted clean above the zero axis, which is actually very interesting to see. As I've said before, it's easier for me to bridge force and energy out without a weapon interposed between me and the target. And these graphs offer some proof of that. As you can see, the amount by which my bare hand graphs, the graphs of my bare hand strikes have been lifted is considerably more than in the weapon strikes, whether the Mace or the Flail. In some of my bare hand strikes, the the graph actually remains above the zero axis until the second or third oscillation. In fact, throughout this entire section of the waveform, the impulse being transferred to the target, or in this case the load cell, is positive throughout the whole duration, which means that if you were to integrate, or even through a simple integration, for instance, like a bar graph or bar chart style integration, you'll find that the impulse is positive for this whole section of the waveform, whereas if you have a look at the weapon strikes or the weight drops, you'll notice that if you were to integrate over the same period of time, some of it will be negative, which is actually going to be reducing the impulse, because of course impulse is a vector quantity. So in this case, dropping below the zero axis is actually going to be reversing the direction of that vector. I've also plotted some of the Wushu scientists' bare hand strikes, and we can see the same phenomenon in her strikes as well, in that the whole graph is shifted up in relation to the zero axis or the x-axis. Although in the Wushu scientist's case, it's not shifted up quite as high as my set of bare hand strikes, and that is most likely due to lack of experience in use of internal dynamics to modify the amount of force and energy produced in a strike, and that of course will improve as the Wushu scientist's level of experience in the system improves as well. In fact, if you compare just the kinetic energy of the Wushu scientist's strikes with my strikes, it's quite possible that the Wushu scientist is actually generating more kinetic energy in her striking than I am. And the only reason that my peak force is higher than hers is because by use of the internal control, I've managed to shift my graph up to the point where my peak outmatches hers. And if she was using the same level of internal control with her strikes, it may be that she would be producing, in this case, more peak force than I would be able to generate. So I'd really like to explore this in a lot more detail in future videos. What I would like to do in future is to plot the underlying chi pulse and study its characteristics in more detail. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're so inclined, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.